37 people. She kept count by carving a small notch into the wooden beam above her sleeping mat for every life she pulled back from death's edge. The plantation ledgers in Henrico County, Virginia, called her property. The families she saved called her miracle worker. The magistrate who signed her death warrant called her witch. On the morning they came to burn her, the iron chains they'd wrapped around her wrists the night before were found coiled neatly on the prison floor. The door remained locked from the outside. The window bars showed no tampering. She was simply gone. What happened next would be deliberately erased from every official record in the colony. But you can't burn away the truth when it's been carved into too many memories, whispered across too many kitchen fires, sewn into too many quilts that served as maps for the desperate. Tonight, you'll discover what really happened to the woman they called Abina, and why her vanishing terrified Virginia's elite more than any execution ever could. Before we continue with the story of the healer who defied death itself, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me what state you're watching from, and whether you've ever heard family stories about healers who were persecuted for their gifts. Your stories matter. Now, let's go back to 1742, to a place where knowing too much could get you killed. The Montrose plantation sat on 1,200 acres of Virginia's most profitable tobacco land, where the James River bent like a question mark through soil so rich it looked black when the plow turned it. By 1742, tobacco had made Virginia's planters wealthier than minor English nobility, and twice as arrogant. The humid summer air tasted of money and sweat, both extracted from the same source. Richard Montrose inherited the estate at 26 when his father choked to death on a piece of poorly chewed venison, a death so absurd that Richard spent years trying to make people forget it through excessive displays of refinement. He filled the house with furniture shipped from London, hosted elaborate dinners, and dressed his house slaves in livery that cost more than most farmers earned in a year. His wife, Elizabeth, had been 15 at their wedding, chosen for her father's shipping connections and her pale, fragile beauty that Virginia society considered the height of feminine perfection. The enslaved community at Montrose lived in a cluster of crude cabins beyond the tobacco barns, close enough to respond to the bell that summoned them to 14-hour workdays, far enough that their humanity wouldn't intrude on the main house's aesthetic. They worked the tobacco fields in heat that killed at least 2 people every summer, their hands stained permanently brown from handling leaves that would be shipped to English pipes and French salons. Abena arrived in chains in August of 1742, purchased from a slave trader in Richmond who'd acquired her from a failed plantation in the Carolinas. The bill of sale listed her as approximately 28 years of age, strong constitution, field work, or domestic service. It said nothing about the knowledge she carried in her mind, or the small dustkin bag she'd somehow kept hidden during the entire journey north, or the way her eyes assessed everything with an intelligence that made the overseer immediately uncomfortable. She was shorter than average, but moved with the efficiency that suggested strength concentrated rather than lacking. Her hands bore scars from burns and blade cuts, the kind you get from years of working with fire and sharp tools. When she looked at you, really looked at you, people said it felt like being read in a language you didn't know existed. The first month, she worked the tobacco fields and said nothing. She learned who held power and who held grudges. She learned which overseers hit first and asked questions never. She learned the rhythm of Montrose, the small cruelties and larger horrors that structured every dawn. It was a field worker named Jacob who first discovered what she could do, though he'd later wish he'd kept that knowledge to himself. He'd been bitten by a copperhead while clearing brush near the creek, the snake's fangs sinking deep into his calf before he could jump back. Everyone knew what came next. The leg would swell, turn black, probably need amputation. If the poison reached his heart first, he'd be dead by morning. Either way, he was useless for work, which meant the overseer noted it in his log with the enthusiasm of a man recording broken equipment. Jacob dragged himself back to the quarters that evening, his leg already swelling grotesquely, and collapsed outside his cabin. Abina was walking past, carrying water from the well. She stopped, looked at his leg, then at his face. "Copperhead?" she asked. He nodded, teeth chattering despite the August heat. She disappeared into her cabin and emerged moments later with her duskin bag. Without asking permission, without explanation, she began working. She cut the bite area slightly with a small blade so sharp he barely felt it, pressed around the wound in a specific pattern that made dark blood and venom ooze out. Then she crushed something from her bag, leaves that smelled bitter and clean, mixed it with her own spit, and packed it directly into the wound. "This will hurt worse before it helps," she said, her voice carrying an accent nobody could quite place, something that suggested many places or perhaps none at all. "Don't scream. We don't need attention." The pain that hit him was blinding, like fire and ice fighting inside his leg. He bit down on the leather strap she shoved between his teeth and rode it out. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, the pain shifted from unbearable to merely agonizing. She bound the wound with strips of cloth, then made him drink something that tasted like dirt and made his tongue go numb. "Sleep," she commanded. "Your body needs to fight." 3 days later, Jacob walked to the fields without limping. The swelling had vanished. The wound was closing clean. The overseer stared at him like he'd witnessed resurrection, made a note in his log, and said nothing. But everyone in the quarters saw, and seeing, they remembered. Word traveled the way it always did in places where people weren't allowed to gather or speak freely, in glances while working side by side, in songs that seemed to be about biblical deliverance but contained other information, in the careful code of people who'd learned that survival meant communication without detection. Others came to her after dark, when the overseers were drunk or sleeping, a woman hemorrhaging 3 days after childbirth, the midwife having given up, a child with fever so high he was having seizures, an old man whose infected tooth had swollen his face until he couldn't eat, a young woman whose master's violence had left injuries that wouldn't heal. Abina treated them all in near silence, her hands moving with absolute certainty. She never asked for payment because what did any of them have? But they left gifts anyway. A carved wooden comb, a handful of seeds saved from rations, a rabbit someone had trapped in the woods. Tokens that said, "You matter, what you did matters, we see you." She kept count by carving those notches in the beam above her sleeping mat, 1 notch for each life saved. By winter of 1743, she had 11 notches. By spring of 1744, she had 19. The first time the main house took notice was when the overseer, a brutal Scotsman named Wallace, who ruled the plantation with fists and whip, developed a fever that wouldn't break. For 4 days he thrashed in his small house near the tobacco barns, his skin burning hot enough to feel from a foot away. Richard Montrose sent for the doctor from Richmond, but the doctor was attending a difficult birth for a wealthy family and wouldn't come for a mere overseer. One of the house slaves, an elderly woman named Grace who'd watched Abina work in the quarters, quietly suggested to Elizabeth Montrose that perhaps Abina knew something about fevers. Elizabeth, desperate because Wallace was the only overseer who could manage the field slaves without constant supervision, agreed. Abina examined Wallace with the same careful attention she gave everyone, regardless of how much she personally wanted to let him die. His symptoms told a story: bad water, probably from the stagnant barrel near the barns where mosquitoes bred, combined with exhaustion and an infected wound on his hand he'd been ignoring. She made him drink a tea so bitter he gagged, applied a poultice to the infected hand that smelled like rotting earth, but drew out the pus, and forced fluids down his throat every hour for 2 days straight. On the 3rd day, his fever broke. On the 4th day he was shouting orders again, though with slightly less violence than before, as if some part of him remembered being helpless. Richard Montrose noted this in his personal ledger. The Negro woman Abina has demonstrated valuable medical knowledge, saved Wallace from fever. Consider expanding her domestic duties to include medical care for property. Property caring for property. That's how he saw it. Elizabeth's crisis came in the winter of 1745. What began as a persistent cough became something far worse, a rattling in her chest that kept her awake at night, blood on her handkerchiefs that she tried to hide from her husband. The Richmond physician, Dr. Cornelius Marsh, prescribed bleeding, mercury treatments, and complete bed rest in a sealed room to prevent dangerous drafts. After 3 weeks of Dr. Marsh's care, Elizabeth could barely lift her head from the pillow. She'd lost so much weight that her wedding ring slipped off her finger. She coughed blood in quantities that frightened even the house slaves who'd seen plenty of death. Richard stood in his study and calculated. His wife was 21 years old and dying. If she died childless, her father might demand the return of her dowry and, more importantly, withdraw his shipping contracts. Richard needed her alive, even if only long enough to produce an heir. Grace, suggested Abina again more insistently this time. Richard, with nothing left to lose, agreed. Abina stood in Elizabeth's bedroom doorway and took in everything. The windows sealed shut with wax and cloth, the chamber pot reeking of infection, the grey skin, the rapid, shallow breathing. The room smelled like death already shopping for real estate. "She needs air," Abina said directly to Richard, a statement that would have earned most enslaved people a strike for presumption. "Clean air. These windows must open now." "Dr. Marsh said drafts would kill her," Richard protested weakly. Abina looked at him with those assessing eyes. "Dr. Marsh is killing her. The question is whether you'll let him finish." Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the certainty in her voice. Maybe it was the same instinct that made successful planters successful, the ability to recognize value, regardless of its packaging. Richard ordered the windows opened. Abina returned that evening with bundles she'd gathered from the woods, plants that most people walked past without seeing. She boiled water in the kitchen, scandalized the cook by taking over her domain, and created a tea that smelled of mint and something medicinal that made your eyes water. She made Elizabeth drink it 4 times daily. She mixed a paste that she rubbed on Elizabeth's chest and back, something that burned and loosened whatever was drowning her lungs. Most importantly, she insisted Elizabeth sit outside for 3 hours every day, wrapped in blankets, breathing winter air that was cold and clean. Dr. Marsh, learning of this treatment, arrived at Montrose in high fury. He pronounced it dangerous ignorance, warned Richard that he was allowing a slave superstition to murder his wife, and threatened to report this to other physicians as a cautionary tale. But Elizabeth was dying under Marsh's care, and nobody could deny that. Richard told the doctor to leave and continued Abina's treatment. 4 weeks later, Elizabeth walked downstairs to dinner. 6 weeks later, her cough had diminished to occasional clearing. 8 weeks later, she asked to see her embroidery, which everyone understood meant she expected to live long enough to finish it. The story exploded through Henrico County like fire through dry tobacco. The Montrose slave who'd saved Elizabeth became the subject of parlor gossip, church whispers, and increasingly desperate requests. Other plantation families began asking, always carefully, always through proper channels, if they might borrow Abina's services, because a skilled slave's time was valuable, and Richard Montrose was a businessman before anything else. Abina treated the Harrison family's twin daughters when they contracted measles, and the local doctor said at least one would die. Both lived. She cured Stephen Blackwell's chronic stomach pain that had plagued him for a decade. She helped deliver Martha Pettigrew's breech baby when 2 midwives had given up. She treated infected wounds, mysterious fevers, women's ailments that doctors refused to take seriously, and conditions that nobody could name, but everybody recognized. The enslaved communities watched this with complicated feelings. Abina's skills brought her privileges: better food, a private cabin, exemption from fieldwork, sometimes even payment that Richard kept for himself while giving her occasional small rewards. But being valuable to white owners was its own kind of danger. You became investment instead of human, property that required extra security, a thing that might develop ideas above its station. Abina kept carving notches. By summer of 1755, she had 37 marks in that beam, 37 lives pulled back from death. The 38th would destroy everything. His name was Thomas, and he was Richard Montrose's firstborn son, born in 1749 after Elizabeth finally carried a pregnancy to term. The boy was Richard's entire future, the heir who would inherit Montrose and continue the family name. He was 6 years old in the summer of 1755, indulged and adored in the way that only sons of wealthy men could be. Thomas developed a fever on July 12th. At first, nobody worried. Children got fevers. They recovered. But by the second day, the fever had climbed so high that Thomas began speaking to people who weren't there, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Abena examined him with her usual thoroughness, feeling his forehead, his neck, checking his tongue, his breathing, the rash that was beginning to appear on his chest. She recognized the pattern immediately. She'd seen it twice before in the quarters, and both times she'd successfully treated it with a specific regimen: cooling baths every 2 hours, a tea made from willow bark and elderflower, and most importantly, time for the fever to run its course without interference. 3 days, she told Elizabeth, who was gripping her son's small hand like she could anchor him to life through touch alone. The fever will peak tonight or tomorrow, then begin falling. Keep him cool. Make him drink the tea I'll prepare. Don't let anyone bleed him. His body needs its strength to fight. But Richard, panicked by his son's delirium, had already sent a rider to Richmond for Dr. Marsh. The physician arrived the next afternoon in his black carriage, carrying his leather bag of instruments that gleamed with civilized authority. Dr. Marsh examined Thomas with practiced efficiency, noted the high fever and rash, and pronounced his diagnosis with the confidence of a man educated at the College of Philadelphia: putrid fever with corrupt humors. Standard treatment protocol: immediate bleeding to release the bad blood, purgatives to clear the bowels, and complete immobilization to prevent the fever from spreading to the brain. Abena, who'd been standing quietly in the corner of the room, spoke up. The bleeding will weaken him when he needs strength. The fever is fighting something in his blood. If you drain his blood, you drain his ability to fight. The room went silent. A slave had just contradicted a physician in front of the family she served. Dr. Marsh turned purple. His voice came out strangled with rage. You dare question my medical judgment? I studied under Benjamin Rush himself. I have treated fever in 3 colonies. And you, a slave woman with some hedge knowledge picked up from God knows where, presume to countermand my professional diagnosis? I presume to have watched 2 children survive this exact fever using my methods, Abena said, her voice level but unyielding. And I presume to know that your bleeding kills more than it cures. The confrontation escalated rapidly. Dr. Marsh declared that Richard must choose. Either Marsh's educated treatment based on the latest medical science or Abena's plantation superstition based on ignorant observation. To continue with Abena's remedies while rejecting Marsh's protocols would be a public humiliation of a respected physician, an insult that no gentleman could permit without losing standing in colonial society. More than that, Marsh said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. Allowing a slave to practice medicine contradicted the natural order. If slaves could heal better than trained physicians, what did that say about the fundamental superiority that justified slavery itself? The question couldn't be allowed to exist, let alone be answered. Richard looked at his feverish son. He looked at his wife, who was silently weeping. He looked at Dr. Marsh with his Philadelphia education and professional reputation. He looked at Abena with her carved notches and impossible cures. He chose civilization over results. He chose credentials over competence. He chose what society would accept over what his instincts whispered might be true. Abena, return to your cabin, Richard said, his voice hoarse. Dr. Marsh will handle Thomas's treatment. You are forbidden from entering the main house until further notice. Abena looked at Thomas, at the small boy who'd sometimes snuck into the kitchen to watch her prepare remedies, who'd asked innocent questions about plants and healing because children haven't yet learned what they're not supposed to be curious about. She looked at Elizabeth, who wouldn't meet her eyes. She looked at Richard, who couldn't. He'll die, Abena said quietly. Not from the fever, from the treatment. "Get out," Richard said. Dr. Marsh bled Thomas twice that day, collecting dark blood in a pewter bowl while explaining to Richard and Elizabeth that the corrupt humours were being expelled. The boy grew weaker, his already pale skin becoming translucent. The fever climbed higher. On the second day, Marsh administered purgatives that left Thomas unable to keep down even water. The rash spread across his entire body. His breathing became laboured. On the third day, Thomas briefly seemed to improve. His fever dropped slightly. Marsh declared this proof that his treatment was working, that the crisis had passed. He collected his substantial fee and departed for another patient in Richmond, leaving instructions for continued bed rest and one more bleeding if the fever returned. On the fourth day, Thomas's fever spiked again, higher than before. His weakened body had nothing left to fight with. By evening, he was unconscious. By midnight, he was dead. Elizabeth's screams woke everyone on the plantation. She threw herself on her son's small body and had to be physically pulled away by house slaves who were weeping themselves. Richard sat in his study with a bottle of whiskey and stared at nothing, his face a mask that couldn't decide between grief and rage. In her cabin in the quarters, Abina wept for a child she could have saved if they'd let her. She carved a small mark below her 37 notches, a different kind of mark, an X that meant lost because they chose pride over sense. The funeral took place 3 days later with half the county in attendance. Elizabeth, dressed in black that made her look like a ghost, could barely stand even with support. Richard's face had hardened into something that needed a target for the rage that was eating him alive. The accusation began not with Richard, but with Dr. Marsh. 6 days after Thomas's death, at a dinner hosted by the Harrison family, Marsh mentioned casually over wine that he'd always found it peculiar how effective Abina's remedies seemed to be. Almost unnaturally so, he mused. One wondered what precisely went into those concoctions of hers, what secret ingredients she might be using that exceeded normal botanical knowledge. Mrs. Harrison, whose twin daughters Abina had saved from measles, felt ice in her stomach. What if those cures hadn't been medicine at all? What if they'd been something darker? She'd never actually seen what Abina put in those remedies. Nobody had. The woman worked in private, in darkness, using knowledge that came from nowhere anyone could trace. The whispers spread through Henrico County like poison in groundwater. Abina's cures worked too well to be natural. There had to be something else. Some forbidden knowledge, some compact with forces that exceeded human ability. And if she could heal with such effectiveness, couldn't she also harm? "Think about young Thomas," the whispers said. "He died after Abina was forbidden to treat him. What if her remedies had created some dependency in the family? What if she'd been slowly working some corruption into the household that made them vulnerable when her access was removed? What if she'd been poisoning them all along for reasons only she understood, and Thomas's death was the plan finally succeeding? The theological implications were discussed in parlors and churches across the county. Virginia had no history of witch trials like Massachusetts or Connecticut, but everyone knew the stories. They knew that Satan worked through human instruments, often choosing the vulnerable, women, servants, slaves, to do his bidding because they were easiest to corrupt. Wasn't it suspicious that a slave woman possessed medical knowledge that exceeded trained physicians who'd studied at proper universities? Where could such knowledge originate except from a supernatural source? And if supernatural, then almost certainly demonic, because God's gifts came through proper channels, education, church, legitimate authority, not through an enslaved woman who couldn't even read. Except Abina could read. That fact emerged during the whispered investigations, discovered when someone recalled seeing her examining a medical text that Dr. Marsh had left behind once. She'd been looking at the illustrations, people had assumed, because slaves couldn't read. But what if she'd been reading the words? What if she'd taught herself somehow, which was illegal and suggested an intelligence that exceeded her station? Richard Montrose, drowning in grief that was curdling into rage, seized onto these whispers like a drowning man grabbing at anything solid. His son was dead. Someone had to be responsible. And if Urbana's healing had always been demonic rather than medical, then she'd been corrupting his household for 13 years. Perhaps Elizabeth's recovery had been false, a temporary reprieve granted by dark powers to build trust. Perhaps every cure she'd performed had extracted some spiritual price that had finally come due in Thomas's death. The logic was insane, but grief makes people insane, and Richard needed someone to blame besides himself for choosing Dr. Marsh over results. On August 3rd, 1755, Richard filed a formal complaint with the Henrico County magistrate, accusing Urbana of practicing witchcraft, of using diabolical arts and poisonous substances to achieve her cures, and of deliberately causing his son's death through supernatural means designed to punish Richard for some perceived slight. The magistrate, a planter named William Byrd III, who'd recently lost a valuable slave to mysterious illness, agreed to investigate. The accusation was legally questionable. Virginia had no specific witchcraft statutes, and the colonial government generally viewed such charges as primitive superstition. But Byrd had his own reasons for wanting to examine whether slaves were practicing medicine beyond their station. Urbana was arrested on August 5th at dawn. They came with 6 men, an absurd number for one woman who'd never shown violence, but fear makes people cautious. They found her in her cabin, awake as always before sunrise, grinding herbs with her stone mortar. The duskin bag she wore around her neck was removed and searched with great ceremony. Inside they found dried leaves of various plants, small roots wrapped in cloth, a piece of clear quartz, a needle and thread, and a small notebook filled with writing and drawings. "She can write," the lead constable said, genuine shock in his voice. "A slave who writes." The notebook was presented as primary evidence of her occult knowledge. It was filled with detailed drawings of plants, notes on their properties, observations about which remedies worked for which conditions, careful documentation of every treatment she'd attempted. To anyone with medical knowledge, it was clearly the work of a brilliant empirical mind. To the investigators, it was proof of unnatural learning. They took her to the Henrico County Courthouse in chains, an unnecessary cruelty since she made no attempt to resist, and locked her in the stone jail behind the building. The jail was new, built just 3 years earlier, with thick walls and an iron door that represented colonial civilization's advance over wilderness chaos. The trial began on August 18th and lasted 4 days. It was a spectacle that drew crowds from across the county, people eager to see a witch tried, eager for the entertainment of watching someone powerful become powerless. Dr. Marsh testified that Urbana's remedies violated natural law and established medical principles. He explained with great authority that her cures worked through supernatural means because they contradicted everything he'd been taught at the College of Philadelphia. When asked how he could be certain they were supernatural rather than simply more effective than his methods, he grew red-faced and declared that the question itself was insulting to legitimate medicine. Mrs. Harrison testified, weeping, that Urbana had always seemed uncanny in her abilities. She'd known things she shouldn't have known, predicted illnesses before symptoms appeared, found herbs that nobody else could identify. How could such knowledge be natural? Other witnesses came forward with stories that accumulated like evidence. Urbana had once predicted which slave would fall ill before any symptoms showed. She'd found water during a drought by walking through the woods as if following invisible guidance. She'd looked at a pregnant woman and known the baby wouldn't survive, and she'd been correct. She'd treated a man's wound that 3 doctors said would turn gangrenous, and it had healed perfectly. Each story, innocent or even admirable in isolation, was presented as proof of supernatural power. The fact that she was usually correct became evidence against her. Natural medicine, they argued, involved failure and uncertainty. Only demonic power produced such consistent success. Urbana was not permitted to testify in her own defense. Virginia law prohibited slaves from giving testimony against white citizens. But Magistrate Bird, troubled by the proceedings' irregular nature and aware that other colonies were watching Virginia's handling of this case, asked if she had anything to say regarding the charges. She stood in the courthouse in the same plain dress she'd been arrested in, her hands bound in front of her, and spoke clearly enough that every person in the crowded room could hear. I learned healing from my mother, who learned from her mother, who learned from her mother across the ocean. Every plant has properties that can be observed and tested. Every illness follows patterns that can be recognized and understood. I watched. I remembered. I learned. There's no magic in it. Only attention to what's real, instead of what someone wrote in a book they memorized without questioning. Magistrate Bird leaned forward. Then explain how you knew, Mrs. Harrison's daughters would survive when 3 physicians said they would die. Abina looked at him steadily. The physicians were treating their textbooks instead of watching the actual children. They saw fever and rash and assumed the worst because that's what their education taught them to assume. I saw 2 strong children whose bodies were fighting effectively. I saw symptoms that were dramatic but not deadly if supported properly. I watched what was actually happening instead of what I expected to happen. The children lived because reality doesn't care about medical credentials. The courtroom erupted. Magistrate Bird called for order. Dr. Marsh stood up and declared that this was precisely the kind of dangerous thinking that proved demonic influence, this rejection of legitimate authority and education in favor of mere observation. Mere observation, Abina said, her voice cutting through the noise. Saved 37 lives. How many has your education saved, doctor? How many has it killed? The question hung in the air like smoke. Nobody answered it. The verdict came on August 21st, 1755. Guilty of practicing witchcraft and causing death through supernatural means. The sentence, death by burning, to be carried out at dawn on August 25th. Elizabeth Montrose, when she heard the verdict, locked herself in Thomas's room and wouldn't come out. Richard drank and told himself justice had been served, though the whiskey couldn't wash away the small voice asking what if she'd been right about the bleeding. In the quarters, the enslaved community said nothing aloud, but that night they sang songs that hadn't been heard in years, old songs about tricksters and clever rabbits, songs about those who escaped bondage through cunning, songs about justice that came from unexpected places. In her cell, Abina sat with her back against the cold stone and calculated her chances. They weren't good. The jail was solid, the guard was vigilant, and she had no allies with power. But she had something else. She had knowledge. And knowledge, applied correctly, could be more powerful than keys. The jailer was a man named Samuel Porter, 41 years old, who'd taken the position after his tobacco farm failed 3 years earlier. He wasn't cruel by nature, but neither was he sympathetic. Prisoners were prisoners, and witches especially deserved no mercy. He'd attended the trial all 4 days, sitting in the back row, watching Abina with the fascination of a man who'd never seen anything genuinely unusual in his ordinary life. He brought her food twice daily. Cornmeal mush in the morning, dried meat and water in the evening. He rarely spoke beyond announcing when he was opening the door. But he watched her carefully. The way you watch something dangerous that might suddenly reveal its true nature. Abina watched him back. She noticed everything. The slight limp in his left leg that worsened in damp weather, suggesting old injury rather than recent. The way he rubbed his right wrist unconsciously, the gesture of someone with chronic pain. The lines around his eyes that came from squinting, not age, which meant his vision was failing. The smell of tobacco on his clothes mixed with something else, something medicinal that she recognized as a common but ineffective salve for joint pain. On the evening of August 22nd, 3 days before her scheduled execution, Porter brought her evening meal and found Abina sitting cross-legged in the center of her cell, eyes closed, completely still. "Your food," he said, setting the wooden bowl inside the door. She opened her eyes and looked at him directly. "Your wrist pains you constantly, worse in the morning, better by midday, worse again when rain is coming." You've been using a salve with camphor and alcohol, but it only masks the pain temporarily without addressing the cause. Porter froze, his hand instinctively moving to his right wrist. How do you know that? I can smell the camphor. I can see how you favor that hand. I've treated this condition 17 times. She paused. The pain comes from inflammation in the joint, made worse by repetitive motion. The salve you're using actually increases inflammation over time because the alcohol dries the tissue. You need willow bark tea taken internally to reduce the inflammation from inside, and a poultice made from comfrey root applied externally to help the joint repair itself. Porter stared at her. You're about to burn for witchcraft, and you're giving me medical advice? I'm about to burn for healing people, Abina corrected. There's a difference, and your wrist will hurt whether I burn or not. Seems wasteful to let knowledge die that could ease suffering. That night, Porter lay awake in his small room adjacent to the jail, his wrist throbbing with the rhythm of his heartbeat. He'd lived with this pain for 5 years, ever since he'd broken the wrist badly and it had healed wrong. 3 doctors had examined it. All 3 had told him nothing could be done except endure. He'd spent money he didn't have on various salves and remedies, none of which provided more than temporary relief. What did he have to lose by trying what the witch suggested? The next morning, he walked into the woods behind the courthouse and found willow trees growing near the creek. He stripped bark from a young branch, the way Abina had described in more detail when he'd returned to ask questions the night before. He boiled it into a bitter tea that made him gag. He found comfrey growing in a damp section of the woods, its leaves distinctive once Abina had described them. He crushed the root and bound it against his wrist with cloth. By evening, the constant edge of pain had dulled to something manageable. By the next morning, August 24th, one day before Abina's execution, Porter woke without the stabbing pain that usually greeted him. His wrist still ached, but it was different, less angry, more like normal soreness than the grinding inflammation he'd lived with for 5 years. He stood in his small room and wrestled with something that felt like his soul tearing in half. The law said Abina would burn. The church said she was in league with dark forces. The magistrate had decided. Dr. Marsh had testified with all his educated authority. But Porter's wrist didn't hurt for the first time in 5 years. And if that was witchcraft, then he wanted no part of a god who called healing evil. He made a decision that would cost him everything he had left. That evening, August 24th, as the sun set in violent reds and oranges that seemed appropriate for the day before an execution, Porter entered Abina's cell. She looked up at him from where she sat, her back against the wall, her hands marked with the rope burns from being kept bound during the trial. "Your wrist is better," she said. "Not a question. Much better." He paused, then spoke in a rush, as if saying it quickly would make it easier. "I'm going to leave this door unlocked tonight. At midnight, I'll be in my room. Asleep. Heavy asleep, the kind where a person might not wake even if someone walked past. There's a horse in the stable behind the courthouse, a mare with a gentle temperament. She's not locked up properly. Careless of someone." Abina stood slowly. "They'll know you helped. They'll suspect. But I'm a free man who drinks, and everyone knows it. I'll say, I was drunk, passed out, woke to find you gone. They can't prove otherwise, can't torture a confession from someone with rights." He pulled a small bundle from under his coat. "Food, a knife, flint, a compass. It's all I can give you. Where should I go?" "West, into the mountains. There are places where colonial authority doesn't reach, where Cherokee and settlers and people like you live by different rules. Follow the James River upstream for 2 days, then turn north at the Big Falls. You'll find a settlement. Mixed people, free blacks, Cherokee, white families who don't ask questions. They need healers badly enough not to care where you came from." Abina took the bundle. "They'll take your position, probably fine you. Maybe worse." Porter smiled, and it was genuine. "I lost my farm to debt, lost my wife to fever 3 years ago, lost my son to the war with the French. This job was all I had left, and it's not much. But 5 years ago, I broke my wrist, and 3 educated doctors told me I'd hurt until I died. Last night was the first night I slept through without waking from pain. That's worth a job, Miss Urbina. That's worth more than a job. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. Because I sat through 4 days of that trial, and I heard every word. I heard them say your crime was being too good at healing. I heard them say you threatened the natural order by knowing more than educated men. I heard them twist 37 saved lives into evidence of evil. He met her eyes. I'm not an educated man, Miss Urbina, never went to any college, but I know the difference between healing and harming. And I know that burning you won't make anyone safer. It'll just mean more people die of things you could have cured. That's not justice. That's waste. At precisely midnight, Urbina walked out of her cell. The door stood open, exactly as Porter had promised. She moved through the dark jail like water, making no sound. She could hear Porter in his room, his breathing deep and regular, genuinely asleep or performing it perfectly. She paused at his doorway. "Thank you," she whispered. From inside the room, so quietly she almost missed it. "Live well." The stable was where he'd said, "The mare," exactly as gentle as promised. Urbina had learned to ride years ago, a skill that plantation owners discouraged in slaves because mobility was dangerous to people who wanted you contained. She mounted smoothly and guided the horse west, away from Henrico County, away from the stake that had been prepared in the courthouse square. Dawn came at 5:52 a.m. on August 25th, 1755. The execution was scheduled for 6 o'clock, giving the condemned time for final prayers. A crowd had already gathered, dozens of people eager to witness divine justice enacted on a witch who dared to challenge educated authority. When Porter arrived at the cell to escort Urbina to her execution, he performed shock and alarm with the skill of a man who'd rehearsed it. "She's gone! The prisoner has escaped!" Magistrate Bird arrived within 15 minutes, still buttoning his coat. Richard Montrose came running, his face swinging between hope that the witch had truly vanished and rage that she'd escaped punishment. Dr. Marsh arrived to observe and provide expert testimony on whether supernatural means had been employed. Half of Henrico County gathered to witness the scandal. The cell was examined minutely. The lock showed no signs of tampering because it had been opened with a key. The iron door hung properly on its hinges. The window, a narrow slit too small for even a child to squeeze through, remained securely barred. The walls were solid stone. There was no tunnel, no loosened mortar, no hidden passage. She simply vanished. "Witchcraft," someone whispered, and the word spread through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. Vanished like smoke, like a demon returning to hell. Dr. Marsh seized on this immediately. Clear evidence that our judgment was correct. Only supernatural powers could accomplish such an escape. She's proven her guilt through the very act of fleeing. But Magistrate Bird, examining the cell personally, found himself troubled by a more practical question. If she possessed supernatural powers sufficient to escape through solid walls, why wait until the night before execution? Why not escape immediately upon arrest? Why endure 3 weeks of imprisonment? Nobody had a good answer. The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and unanswered. A search party was organized within the hour. 12 men, experienced hunters and trackers, led by a frontiersman named Jacob Reese, who could supposedly track a snake across bare rock. They found no hoofprints near the jail, no broken branches in the nearby woods, no sign of passage in any direction. It was as if she'd simply ceased to exist the moment she left the cell. Which, the whispers said, was exactly what demons did when their earthly work was finished. Richard Montrose offered a reward, £100 for Urbina's capture, dead or alive. It was an enormous sum, enough to buy prime tobacco land or a dozen slaves. Bounty hunters arrived from 3 colonies, men who specialized in tracking escaped slaves and fugitives through wilderness and settlement alike. They searched for 3 weeks and found nothing. At the Montrose plantation, strange things began happening. Not supernatural, nothing that couldn't be rationally explained, but unsettling in their pattern. The tobacco crop in the Northfields, usually the most reliable, began failing. Investigation revealed that someone had deliberately damaged the irrigation system, allowing the field to flood at precisely the wrong time. Someone with knowledge of tobacco cultivation had done it on purpose. A fire started in the tobacco barn, destroying 2 months of cured leaves ready for market. The cause was never determined, but the burn pattern suggested it began in multiple locations simultaneously. Tools went missing, then turned up in wrong places, fences collapsed, livestock escaped. A section of the main house's roof developed a leak that defied repair, water finding its way through repairs within days of their completion. Each incident could be accident, negligence, or natural misfortune. Taken together, they felt like revenge enacted through 100 small acts of resistance. The enslaved community at Montrose moved through their work with careful neutrality, showing neither satisfaction nor concern. But at night in the quarters, they sang songs that hadn't been heard in years. Old songs from across the ocean, songs about Anansi, the spider who outwitted those stronger than himself, songs about clever rabbits and foolish lions, songs about freedom won through cunning rather than force. Richard began drinking heavily. Elizabeth barely spoke, spending hours in Thomas's room, holding his clothes, whispering to his ghost. The plantation that had been thriving under Abina's secret care began declining, not catastrophically, but steadily, like a body slowly dying from an illness nobody could diagnose. Dr. Marsh wrote and published a pamphlet, an account of witchcraft in Virginia, being a true relation of the escape of the negress Abina through diabolical arts. It sold briskly in Williamsburg, Richmond, and even reached Philadelphia, establishing Marsh's reputation as an expert on supernatural matters. He never mentioned that he'd been wrong about Thomas's treatment. He never acknowledged that Abina's remedies had proven more effective than his university education. In the courthouse, the jail lock was changed to something more substantial. Porter was questioned extensively, but stuck to his story with the stubborn consistency of truth or perfect lies. He'd been drinking, had fallen asleep at his desk, woke to find the cell empty. How? He didn't know. Must have been witchcraft, just like everyone said. Magistrate Byrd didn't believe him. But without proof, without confession, without witnesses, he couldn't prosecute a free white man for mercy. Porter kept his position, though his reputation never fully recovered. Some people avoided him. Others nodded at him with something like respect when they thought nobody was watching. 3 months after Abina's escape, a traveling merchant passing through Henrico mentioned that he'd heard stories from the mountain settlements about a healing woman who'd appeared that autumn. She treated Cherokee and settlers with equal skill, charged nothing from those who had nothing, and moved through the back country like she'd always been there. When asked what she looked like, the merchant shrugged. "Didn't see her myself. Just heard the stories. They say she's got hands that work with absolute certainty, like they know things her mind hasn't thought yet. They say she keeps count of the lives she saves by carving notches into a wooden beam wherever she's staying. Magistrate Byrd sent inquiries west, but received no cooperation. The back country operated by different rules, and a skilled healer, whatever her legal status in eastern Virginia, was too valuable to surrender for any reward. The truth about Abina's escape remained hidden for 23 years, until 1778, when Samuel Porter lay dying of the pneumonia that had ravaged Henrico County that winter. With death approaching and conscience weighing heavy, he sent for his pastor, Reverend Thomas Williams, and made a confession. "I let her go," Porter said, his voice weak but clear, each word costing him breath he didn't have to spare. "I unlocked the door. I gave her supplies and directions. She didn't vanish through witchcraft. She walked out while I pretended to sleep." Reverend Williams was genuinely shocked. "You allowed a convicted witch to escape? You undermined the court's judgment? I allowed a healer to avoid execution for the crime of being better at medicine than men who charge money for killing people with their ignorance." Porter coughed. the sound wet and painful. She wasn't a witch, Reverend. She was a woman who paid attention to reality instead of textbooks. We burned her because she made educated men feel small, and because she was enslaved and therefore couldn't be permitted to know more than her masters. You risked everything for a slave. Porter's laugh turned into another cough. I risked a job I hated for a woman who cured 5 years of pain in 3 days with tree bark and a plant that grows wild. That's not risking everything, Reverend. That's recognizing value when it appears, even when it comes wrapped in skin that society says shouldn't contain such knowledge. Porter died that evening before he could say more. Reverend Williams was left with a confession that implicated a dead man in a crime that nobody really wanted to prosecute anyway, 23 years after the fact, in the middle of a revolution that was literally redefining justice and authority. Williams made a decision that would define his ministry. He recorded Porter's confession in his private journal, but took no official action. The Revolutionary War was in full chaos. In 1778, British forces controlled much of Virginia. Henrico County itself would see battles in the coming years. Prosecuting a dead man for a decades-old mercy seemed not just absurd, but actively opposed to the ideals that the revolution supposedly embodied. But Williams was curious. If Porter had helped Abina escape, what had happened to her? Had she survived? Had she continued healing? Or had she died in the wilderness, her knowledge lost, her 37 saved lives the final accounting of her existence? The investigation that followed led Williams into the backcountry, into settlements where Virginia's authority had always been more theory than practice, into communities that existed in the spaces between colonial control. He found stories everywhere, a healing woman who'd arrived in the autumn of 1755, exhausted and haunted, but with hands that could pull people back from death. She'd settled near a Cherokee trading path, in a small cabin she'd built herself with help from neighbors who valued skill over status. She'd married, people said, though accounts varied about whom. Some said a Cherokee hunter, others said a free black trader. Still others claimed she'd remained alone, married only to her work. What everyone agreed on was her gift. She'd saved dozens, probably hundreds over the years. She'd trained others, sharing her knowledge freely with anyone willing to learn, creating a network of healers across the backcountry who carried forward her methods. The most detailed account came from an elderly Cherokee woman named Ama, who'd known Abena, or Yvette, as she'd renamed herself in the mountains for nearly 20 years before her death. She arrived broken, Ama told Reverend Williams in 1780, speaking through a translator, not in body but in spirit. She'd been hunted for saving lives. That kind of betrayal damages something deep. But she healed herself the way she healed others, slowly, with attention and time and the refusal to let poison remain in the wound. Yvette had lived in the mountains for 18 years, from 1755 until her death in 1773. She'd continued her work, treating hundreds more people, keeping count by carving notches into the wooden beam of her cabin. By the time of her death, she had over 200 marks. She died the way she lived, Ama said. There was a woman having terrible trouble in childbirth, 3 days' walk away. Yvette was 66 years old, too old to be walking 3 days through mountains, but she went anyway. She delivered the baby, saved the mother. Both lived. But the journey in winter cold, the work through the night, it was too much. She developed fever, then pneumonia. She died 4 days after that baby took its first breath. Her last words? Reverend Williams asked. 212, Ama said. She was counting, always counting. The baby she just delivered was number 212. Williams asked about Yvette's cabin, whether anything remained. Ama led him to the site. The cabin had been partially dismantled after Yvette's death, its materials used by neighbors for their own repairs, the practical recycling of the frontier. But the beam with the notches had been preserved, kept by a family whose son, Yvette, had saved from a copperhead bite. Williams examined the beam carefully. 212 careful marks carved into the wood. 212 lives that official records would never count, that history would never acknowledge, that existed only in family memories and scarred wood. Below the notches, carved in letters that had taken obvious effort, were words in English. They burned me for healing. I healed anyway. Count what matters. Reverend Williams brought the beam back to Henrico County in 1780, carrying it like sacred cargo through a landscape torn by war. He placed it in his church's vestry, wrote a detailed account of his investigation in his journal, and began quietly asking questions about what had really happened 25 years earlier. The questions led him to unexpected places, to elderly slaves who remembered Abina with a reverence they reserved for nothing else, to free black families who'd heard stories passed down about the healer who'd escaped, to white families who'd once sought her help and now claimed they'd always suspected something unnatural, and to one person who changed everything Williams thought he understood about the case. Her name was Grace, the same elderly house slave who'd first suggested Abina to Elizabeth Montrose decades earlier. She was 73 years old in 1780, still living at Montrose despite Richard's death in 1772 and Elizabeth's in 1775. The plantation had passed to a cousin who'd kept most of the enslaved people because they came with the property. Grace found Williams in the churchyard one afternoon in late summer, when the heat made everyone move slowly. "You've been asking about Abina," she said without preamble, asking the wrong questions. Williams invited her to sit on a bench in the shade. "What should I be asking? Not whether she was a witch, not whether Samuel Porter helped her escape. You should be asking why 37 saves lives threatened people so badly they needed to burn her." Grace spoke for 2 hours. She told Williams about a network that had existed in shadow across Virginia, a loose organization of enslaved people, free blacks and sympathetic whites who moved information, resources, and occasionally people when the law became so unjust that resistance became moral obligation. "We didn't do it often," Grace said. "Couldn't. Each escape made the next harder, made the masters more watchful. But sometimes a case was so clearly wrong that silence became impossible. Abina was one of those cases." Grace revealed that Porter hadn't been the only person who'd helped Abina escape. The network had been planning her extraction for 2 weeks before Porter made his decision. They'd already identified the route west, the safe houses, the people who'd shelter her. They'd been waiting for an opening, any opening. "Porter gave us the easy way," Grace said. "If he hadn't unlocked that door, we'd found a blacksmith willing to forge a key. If that failed, we'd identified a weak point in the jail wall that could be breached with tools and time. If that failed, we'd planned to create such a distraction during the execution itself that she might slip away in the chaos. One way or another, she wasn't going to burn." Williams was stunned. "You're describing a conspiracy involving dozens of people." "At least," Grace agreed. "Some knew the whole plan. Most knew only their small part, the woman who left food near the old oak tree on the western road, the man who happened to leave a horse poorly secured, the ferryman who developed sudden poor eyesight at dawn, the Cherokee trader who guided people through the mountains. Each person doing one small thing that seemed like carelessness or coincidence, but together made a path to freedom." "Why?" Williams asked. "Why risk so much for one person?" Grace looked at him with eyes that had seen more than he could imagine. "Because by 1755, we'd all seen what happened when knowledge met fear. Abina's crime wasn't witchcraft, it was competence. She made educated white men look incompetent, and worse, she did it while enslaved. That combination couldn't be tolerated." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something intense. "If they'd burned her, Reverend, what message would that send? That any enslaved person with skills exceeding their station could be executed on supernatural charges whenever they made white people uncomfortable. That knowledge itself was crime if held by the wrong person. We couldn't allow that precedent. Not for Abina, not for ourselves, not for everyone who'd come after." Grace revealed something else that Williams hadn't known. Abina hadn't been unique. She'd been part of a broader tradition of African and African-American medical knowledge that enslaved communities preserved and transmitted despite systematic efforts to suppress it. Her trial and threatened execution had simply made her visible in a way that threatened the entire system. There were dozens like her, Grace said, healers in every county who knew things doctors didn't. Most were smart enough to work quietly, to never cure anyone important enough to attract attention. Abina's mistake was being too good, helping too many people, including white people who talked. Once you become visible, you become dangerous to people invested in the lie that education requires institutions and authority. Williams asked the question that had been haunting him. Did she know about the network planning to help her? Grace smiled. She knew. I visited her in jail 3 times, brought food, read scripture aloud like a good Christian slave. But within those scripture readings, I embedded information, directions, names, safe houses. Abena was smart enough to hear what I wasn't saying directly. So when Porter unlocked that door, she already knew where to go and who would help her get there. Porter gave her the opening. We gave her the path. She gave herself the courage to walk it. Before they parted, Grace asked Williams what he intended to do with this information. The Reverend was honest. He didn't know. Recording it felt important, but publishing it would implicate people still living, still vulnerable. Grace offered advice that Williams would remember for the rest of his life. The war will end eventually, Reverend. When it does, we'll build something new. Or try to. That new country will need to decide what kind of justice it wants. The old kind, where law protects power and property above all else, or something better. Your journal, with Porter's confession and this conversation and everything you learned, keep it. Someday, someone will need to know that even in dark times, some people chose mercy over law. That will matter more than you think. Williams took her advice. His journal remained in his family's possession for generations, a private document recording the moral complexities that official histories preferred to ignore. But the ripples of Abena's case extended far beyond Henrico County in ways nobody at the time could have predicted. In the years following her escape, Virginia saw a notable decline in witchcraft accusations. This wasn't solely due to growing Enlightenment rationality, though that played a role. It was also because Abena's disappearance had demonstrated the practical problems with such prosecutions. If accused witches could escape through supernatural means, what was the point of trials? And if they escaped through human aid, as some suspected, then the social consensus needed for executions was clearly lacking. The system couldn't work if significant portions of the population simply refused to cooperate with it. Dr. Marsh's pamphlet about Abena's case, intended to establish his expertise, actually undermined his credibility. Educated readers in Williamsburg and Philadelphia, influenced by European scientific thinking, found his conclusions embarrassingly credulous. One satirical response published in the Virginia Gazette in 1756 suggested that perhaps Dr. Marsh's medical treatments were the real witchcraft, given how many patients survived specifically by avoiding his care. Marsh's medical practice declined steadily. By 1760, he'd lost most of his wealthy patients. He died in 1767, bitter and largely forgotten, his pamphlet about supernatural healing becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of fighting, losing battles against empirical reality. Meanwhile, Abena's influence spread through the backcountry in ways that traditional history never recorded. The healers she trained, both formally and through example, created networks of medical knowledge that operated parallel to official medicine. These networks saved thousands of lives over the decades, using techniques that worked even when nobody could explain why they worked. In plantation records, family journals, and medical accounts from across the South, careful researchers would later find recurring references to enslaved healers using techniques that matched Abena's methods. Willow bark for fever, comfrey for wounds, specific plants for specific conditions. Knowledge preserved and transmitted through communities that institutions tried to keep ignorant. The leather duskin bag taken from Abina during her arrest, stored in the courthouse, survived the building's partial destruction during the Revolutionary War. It was retrieved by a young medical student named James Wickham, who was fascinated by folk remedies and traditional knowledge that universities dismissed. Wickham documented the contents meticulously: dried willow bark, comfrey root, feverfew, yarrow, and several other botanicals. He tested their properties systematically and found them remarkably effective for various ailments. In his personal journal, preserved now in the Virginia Historical Society, Wickham wrote, "Examine the contents of the so-called witch's pouch today. Every plant she carried has legitimate medicinal properties. Either this woman was extraordinarily lucky in her selections, or she possessed empirical knowledge that exceeded anything I learned in 3 years at the College of William and Mary. I suspect the latter, which troubles me profoundly. How much knowledge have we lost by dismissing the observations of people we've decided are too inferior to possess expertise?" Wickham became a physician who incorporated traditional remedies into his practice. He also trained several apprentices, both white and black, teaching them to observe results rather than merely follow textbooks. His legacy was a small but significant branch of American medicine that valued empirical observation over institutional authority. The story of Abina's life after escape was pieced together over many years from multiple sources. Reverend Williams's investigation provided the foundation, but later researchers added crucial details. In 1823, a historian named Margaret Donovan, while researching Cherokee medical practices, encountered multiple references to a black healer named Yvette, who'd lived among mixed communities in the Virginia mountains for nearly 2 decades. The descriptions matched accounts of Abina too precisely to be coincidence. Donovan discovered that Yvette had married a free black trader named Isaiah, who'd been traveling between settlements, selling tools and textiles. They'd built a life together in a small cabin near a Cherokee village, living in the complex space between colonial control and indigenous autonomy, where people created their own rules. They had no children, whether by choice or circumstance. Records don't say. But Yvette helped deliver over 100 babies in those mountains and trained at least 15 other healers, both Cherokee and settler, who carried forward her methods. Isaiah died in 1768, killed not by violence, but by a sudden illness that even Yvette couldn't cure. "Some things," she told neighbors, "move too fast for healing to catch." She buried him on a hillside overlooking the valley they'd loved, beneath a chestnut tree they'd planted together. She continued her work for 5 more years, now alone but never lonely, her cabin always open to those who needed help. She charged nothing from those who had nothing, accepted payment from those who had something, and turned away no one based on their skin color, their legal status, or their past. In the winter of 1773, word came of a woman 3 days' journey away who'd been in labor for 2 days with a baby that wouldn't come. The local midwife had given up. The family was desperate. Someone mentioned Yvette. She was 66 years old, too old to be walking 3 days through mountain winter. Her joints ached with the cold. Her breathing wasn't what it once was. But a woman was dying and a baby with her, and Yvette had never been able to walk away from that equation. She traveled for 3 days through snow and cold, arrived at a cabin where a woman lay dying, and worked through the night with hands that still knew exactly what to do, even when her body was exhausted. She turned the baby, a procedure that took 8 hours of careful manipulation, and delivered a healthy girl just before dawn. The mother survived. The baby survived. Yvette, who'd walked 3 days through winter at 66 and worked through the night in a freezing cabin, developed pneumonia. She died 4 days later, on February 18th, 1773, in that same cabin, cared for by the family she'd saved. Her last act was to carve one final notch in a piece of wood she'd carried with her, a continuation of the counting she'd begun decades earlier at Montrose. 212 lives, that was her final count. The family buried her on their land, on a hillside that caught the morning sun. Over 50 people attended the funeral: Cherokee, white settlers, free black families, and several people who were clearly enslaved, but visiting relatives for the day, a transparent fiction that everyone politely accepted. One of these visitors was a young woman named Sarah, who traveled from a plantation near Williamsburg. In a letter she later wrote to her sister, a letter preserved in a collection of African-American correspondence, Sarah described attending Yvette's funeral and hearing stories about her life. They say she was born enslaved. They say she was nearly burned for healing people. They say she escaped and lived free for 18 years, healing hundreds more. I stood by her grave and saw people of different colors weeping together, and I thought, if this woman could earn such respect from such different people while starting with nothing, then surely the world contains more possibility than we see in our daily bondage. Her grave gives me hope, sister. If she could escape and live free and be mourned by so many, perhaps others can too. Perhaps someday all of us can. The beam with 212 notches was preserved by the family whose daughter Yvette had delivered in her final act. They kept it for 3 generations before donating it to a small historical society in 1856, where it remained largely forgotten until 1923. That year, a researcher named Helen Cartwright, while investigating African-American medical history, discovered the beam in a storage room. She traced its provenance backward through family records and historical accounts, eventually connecting it to the escaped slave from Henrico County who'd been condemned for witchcraft in 1755. Cartwright's 1927 dissertation, Medical Knowledge and Social Control, The Case of Abena of Virginia, was the first academic work to thoroughly document what had really happened. She proved conclusively that Abena had been a skilled empirical healer, that her escape had been aided by multiple people who recognized an injustice, and that her influence had persisted long after her death through the treatments she pioneered and the healers she trained. Cartwright's work was largely ignored by mainstream historians, partly because it centered a black woman's story in an era when such histories were considered marginal, partly because it complicated comfortable narratives about medical progress and the benevolence of slavery's civilizing influence. But it found an audience among medical historians, anthropologists studying folk medicine, and the growing field of African-American history. It became required reading in certain circles, a foundational text about how knowledge and power intersect, about how institutions suppress expertise that threatens their authority. In 1954, a historical marker was placed near the site where Yvette's cabin had stood in the Virginia mountains. By then, long reclaimed by forest, the location approximate. The marker read, "Near this site lived a healer known as Yvette, believed to be Abena of Henrico County, who escaped execution for witchcraft in 1755 and practiced medicine among Cherokee and settler communities until her death in 1773. She represents the many healers, especially women and people of color, whose knowledge preserved lives and challenged authority in early America while receiving neither recognition nor protection from the institutions they quietly served." The marker lasted until 1968, when vandals destroyed it during a period of intense racial tension. It was never officially replaced, but in 1995, a community group in the area placed an unofficial marker on the approximate site, made from local stone, with Yvette's words carved into it. "They burned me for healing. I healed anyway. Count what matters." In Henrico County itself, the story of Abena evolved over the centuries. By the 1820s, she'd become a ghost story, a witch who escaped through dark magic. By the 1920s, she'd been largely forgotten except by elderly black families who preserved stories of the healer who wouldn't be silenced. By the 1980s, after Cartwright's research had slowly percolated through academic circles into public consciousness, she'd been reclaimed as a symbol of resistance, knowledge persisting against oppression, competence punished by insecurity. In 2008, The Henrico County Historical Commission issued a formal statement acknowledging that Abina's trial had been a miscarriage of justice, that her medical knowledge had been genuine and valuable, and that her persecution represented a shameful chapter in local history. The statement stopped short of an official apology. Authorities in 2008 couldn't apologize for actions taken by different authorities in 1755, but it represented a shift in how the community understood its own past. In 2015, the beam with 212 notches was loaned to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture for a special exhibition on African American medical practitioners. It was displayed alongside Abina's story, Reverend Williams's journal, and artifacts from other healers who'd worked in the shadows of official medicine. Over 500,000 people saw that exhibition. Many stood before the beam with its careful notches and wept, some for Abina specifically, some for everyone like her whose expertise was suppressed, whose knowledge was dismissed, whose lives were threatened for the crime of being too competent while belonging to the wrong category of person. The exhibition included an interactive element. Visitors could contribute stories of healers in their own families, traditional knowledge that had been passed down, times when folk medicine had succeeded where official medicine had failed. Over 12,000 stories were collected. They filled a digital archive that researchers still study, a testament to how much knowledge exists parallel to institutional authority, preserved by communities that institutions tried to keep ignorant. What then was Abina's real legacy? Not the escape itself, dramatic as it was. Not the 212 lives saved, remarkable as that number stands. Not even the healers she trained, though their impact rippled across generations. Her real legacy was the question she forced into existence, a question that still hasn't been fully answered. Who gets to possess knowledge? Who decides what counts as expertise? What happens when empirical results contradict institutional credentials? And, most dangerously, what does it mean when societies systematically suppress the competence of people they've decided should be inferior? These questions didn't die with her in 1773. They didn't stop being relevant when slavery ended. They remain urgent today, whenever people with direct experience are dismissed by people with credentials, whenever observation is rejected in favor of theory, whenever institutions protect their authority by discrediting competence that threatens their monopoly on expertise. Abina's story reminds us that the choice between mercy and law, between results and credentials, between protecting people and protecting systems, is not a choice that was settled in 1755. It's a choice that every generation, every institution, every person in authority must make again and again. Samuel Porter chose mercy over law. Grace and her network chose resistance over compliance. The families in the mountains chose healing over legal status. Each made their choice knowing it would cost them something, but believing that some things matter more than personal cost. And Abina? Abina chose to keep counting, to carve each notch with care, to document each life saved even when no official record would ever acknowledge her work, to keep healing even after they burned her for it, to refuse to let persecution silence competence, to refuse to let fear stop knowledge, to refuse to let injustice define what was possible. 212 notches in a wooden beam, 212 lives that official history never counted, 212 times that someone chose to save rather than abandon, to risk rather than retreat, to care rather than comply. Count what matters. If you're moved by Abina's story of resistance through healing, of knowledge that refused to be silenced, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The Sealed Room brings you these buried American stories, the ones that powerful people tried to erase because they asked uncomfortable questions about authority and justice. Drop a comment telling me, what's your theory about why societies so often punish people for being too competent? Why does expertise threaten authority? I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on this. And if you know someone who needs to hear about historical figures who refuse to let persecution define their possibilities, share this video with them. These stories matter, These lives matter. This history matters. Remember, Abina's real crime wasn't witchcraft. It was proving that knowledge doesn't require institutions, that competence doesn't require credentials, and that the people society calls inferior can sometimes be superior in ways that threaten the entire system. That's why they tried to burn her. That's why she escaped. That's why we remember. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover another story from America's shadows that deserves to be brought into the light.